Ken Sogoyo. My name is Lance Logan Key. Um, so, why this video is being recorded and presented to you is about men uh, in relation to Father's Day. So, this is sort of um, giving you a bit of an understanding. Mind you, when I say understanding, this is particularly my understanding. Um, so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a bit of a picture of where my understanding comes from. So there's some background to it. So um, who I am. So I said Lance Logan Key. That's my English name. My real name is Skalkity. Means other side of heaven. That's Q the word. I'm a Mohawk, Wolf Clan, card-carrying member of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Grew up in a longhouse. Done a lot of work to understand not just the teaching, but the philosophies behind the teachings. Had a 28-year career in therapeutic counseling, training. Worked in family violence. I've worked in mental health. I'm currently working in addictions. I've worked in corrections. I've done a lot of work, and a lot of it has been with men. And my approach to this kind of work is that I don't necessarily fit tradition into programming. That's a bit of it. But more what I do is I develop programming around tradition. So there's wherever I happen to be working, they have their framework, and I use that framework. But it comes from that traditional, cultural, societal perspective of who we are as a group. So that's what I'm going to give you. So in my upbringing, like I said, I grew up in a longhouse. I've had a lot of teachers. I've had a lot of information given to me. And I'm not necessarily accustomed to the idea of a teacher gathering people and saying, oh, I'm going to teach you this now. It was always done in the context of work or whatever activity we were doing. They would remind an older person and they tell us. So that's how I learned a lot of these things. It was also very blunt and crude at times. So now I'm not going to necessarily be crude. I'll probably be a little bit blunt. It's because it's the way I understand it. There wasn't a lot of flowery language. A lot of mystical, ambiguous language. It was pretty much brass tacks. This is what I'm telling you. So that's the way I present it. It makes more sense to me that way. So talking about men. From a Haudenosaunee perspective. So when we talk about men, we have to have a discussion about masculinity, what it is and what it isn't, what it is in terms of who we are versus what it is in terms of the mainstream. And I don't think I really have to go into a whole lot of detail about where the mainstream looks at masculinity. The tough guy. A lot of cases it's this authoritarian, unemotional, very much a surface person who's emotionally detached from other people. I know that's a stereotype, and I know there's a lot of people who come from that mainstream who aren't that. But that tends to be, particularly the ones who make the news a lot. So and usually the news is filled with a lot of bad things, but that tends to be what the picture that we get. And our men, particularly Haudenosaunee, Six Nations, and other indigenous people, our men have been essentially bullied into embodying that, moving away from the traditional understanding of masculinity, the traditional expression of masculinity. So I don't want to do a lot of focus on that. More what I want to focus on is that traditional perspective and expression of masculinity, where it comes from. So my understanding is that, particularly because we're Haudenosaunee, we're a matrilineal society, which means who we are, we get from our mother line. Um, Now that's like my clan, my nation, my mother, my grandmother, and so on. And all descendants will all be that through the mother line. Um, and I think a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that that means men are removed from that or they're excluded from that. They're not. Um, Myself as an uncle, I have a lot of influence in the children that come into our family as Mohawk wolves. So the children born to the female line, um, as part of my responsibility as a Mohawk wolf male in this family, is to be that teacher. Uncle takes on a lot more meaning because, in a sense, what we are is we're also fathers to these children because particularly that's what we teach. We teach them who they are, um, in particular, young boys and young men, what it is to be a member of your clan, of your family. So, eventually, as they get once they're able to sort of look after themselves a little bit, but before they go into puberty, um, young girls will spend a lot of time with their male relatives, their older male relatives. Reason being is because we learn through observation. We're observing. You know, how do the men talk? How do the men work? How do the men do the things that they do? Now, in the old days, that didn't mean that we into the bush and we were clearing land for crops and things like that. You know, that was more the older men who already had children, who were always closer to the village. So they would spend time there, and the work that had to be done around there, and also the downtime when men were just sort of sitting around and talking, or they were sitting around shelling corn and things like that. You spent a lot of time with their older male relatives, so they could see how men are. Same thing with the young boys. You know, they spend a lot of time with their older female relatives, you know, their mothers, aunts, um, grandparents, and things like that, because they were getting a perspective on how women do the things that they do. Because when it was time for puberty, that's when you learned what it was to be, for young boys, a man; for young girls, a woman. Uh, so you switched. You spend a lot more time. And I want to be clear, not all your time, whether before puberty and after puberty. A lot of your time, but not all of it. And it just switched when you got older. So you spent a lot more time with your older male relatives because you were in that place of becoming a man. So you spent time with your uncles. You spent time with older cousins and grandparents and things like that. Because you were learning how to be a man as it meant to be a man within your family, within your clan. So that's when you started going out to the bush. You started going out to the fields. You started learning how to do the harder work. You started to see how men worked with each other. Because part of that is we have a responsibility to cooperate and work with each other. So you learn how to do that. So that's not just a matter of working. That's how do you interact? How do you understand each other? How do you talk? And I don't mean just the talk of work, the talk of sports or anything like that. It's how are you emotional with each other? How are you spiritual with each other? How do you learn to be a nurturer? All of those kinds of things. Because that stereotypical concept of men as this emotionally distant, macho type of person is not our definition of masculinity. Um, our men were very emotional. Our men were very close with their family. Um, it was a hardship for the men to spend time away from the village. So when they talk about like the work that men would do, and sometimes it meant being away from home for days and weeks, seasons. Um, that was a hardship because they were connected. They wanted to be with their families, but it was part of their responsibility to have to do that. So, um, part of that meant you had to support each other. Because generally speaking, if you were being sent out on those kinds of trips, those are people who you know, more than likely family. So being supportive of each other. You know, I miss my wife, I miss my children, I miss my family, I miss my pets. I miss the village. I miss certain things about the village, whatever. But you learn to support each other. So when those boys coming through puberty and coming out of puberty are spending time, that's part of it. They're observing their uncles, older cousins, and things like that, working together and interacting that way, and they're encouraged to ask questions. Why is it that this is done this way? Why is it I have to do this? Why is it that the women do that? Where do we work together and things like that? And sometimes those can be because the idea is the connection. So sometimes it means very intimate, awkward questions are going to come at those uncles. Part of the job as an uncle is to be prepared for that. You have to get past your own awkwardness and your own embarrassment about some of those things, because part of your responsibility as that uncle is to be a guide for those young men. And you're not doing the job if your own embarrassment and your own awkwardness takes precedent over being that guide. So that it's part of the responsibility, but it's also why men support each other, so that we support each other through those moments. And nowadays, I'm experiencing it myself, where me, my brothers, or some other men who we're getting into that stage of grandparent age and things like that, where we're talking about, I remember so and so had asked me this, and I didn't know what to do, and we laugh about it. I mean, in the moment when it was actually happening, it was awkward and embarrassing, but now we can laugh about it. That's part of that way of supporting each other. It's also about being able to admit when you don't know the answer, or you made mistakes, things like that. And part of that uber masculinity thing is being perfect. I don't make mistakes. I always make the right decision. That's impossible. You can't do that. Part of that connecting is that understanding that you can be vulnerable that way. You can admit when you make mistakes. And you should be able to expect support from the men that are with you. If they're not supportive, they're probably men that you want to keep some distance with. They haven't learned yet. Hopefully they will. Maybe you'll be one of their teachers. But usually, if something like that happened, that was also part of that support network, was not chastising them for not being supportive, but pointing out that wasn't a supportive thing. Maybe we need to talk to you as well. But you spend that time talking. Again, awkward conversations, awkward moments. Being humble enough to admit, hey, I made a mistake. But part of this idea of being a man is about honoring that place. Now, before this whole uber masculinity thing came about that we had to deal with, this was just the way it was. So it wasn't a hardship to have to revisit and relearn something. Nowadays it can be a hardship because a lot of us, we didn't grow up with that environment of having men support each other, being okay to make a mistake, it's okay to be vulnerable, it's okay to be emotional. I get all that. But part of that being a man is also understanding and talking about Gunny Kuyo. If you ever get to see that video or other video, another video that I've done around peace, bond, righteousness. This concept of how we think and use our mind. Nothing is just in this moment. There's the future to think about. There's the past to think about. There's perspective to think about. All those things. So that brings about hopefully compassionate understanding that those men in our lives, uncles or fathers or whatever they were, who weren't there as supportive, emotionally connected beings. Um, and that may have been because they weren't taught it themselves. Because we also have to put this back against our history as a people, the oppression that we've gone through, um, the colonization that we've gone through, all of that. So having a bit of a compassion. That doesn't mean that uh, they're not responsible for not giving us those things. They are, but there's reasons for it. There's compassion for it, and part of that learning how to be a man is to be that compassionate being, to have that understanding. Um, but then going forward, taking that and saying, well, what do I need to learn? What do I need to know? What more do I need to do to embody that traditional perspective of masculinity? And that comes through learning how to be a teacher to younger men and things like that, and being connected. So one of the things I haven't mentioned so far is fathers. There's a reason for that. That's not that fathers weren't existent culturally; they were, still are. Um, but traditionally, because the uncles were in that role of being the teachers. Um, because a father was also an uncle, but he was an uncle to his relatives' children, and he was taking on that responsibility of being a teacher for those children. His connection with his own biological children is mostly, not entirely, no, because there was a teaching aspect of all it as well. But for the most part, that was the father's job, was to be in a safe space, an emotional, spiritual support for his children. When he would come back from whatever the work he was doing that day, teaching his nieces and nephews things, um, when they came home to the house that they live in with their wife and her family, um, it was a lot of conversation from what I understand. How was your day? Hi, Iskan again. How are you? Are you well? That was part of that inquiry, was how was your day? How did things go? What did you learn? Um, Telling them how great that was, or answering questions, or I didn't feel good about that, or I made a mistake. Being encouraging, that's a concept that we have as a people, as words of encouragement. So, well, maybe you'll do better tomorrow, or well, keep trying, keep up. That was the father's role. It was to be that emotional support for their children, um, teaching them little things, giving them some direction, but really being emotionally and spiritually supportive of their children. Um, that was a huge part of it. Um, and they were given those spaces to do that. So now, in a more modern sense, the uncle's role as a teacher is a bit diminished. It's still there, and it's hopefully more enhanced for fathers now, because we don't live in longhouses anymore. We live in individual nuclear households and things like that. A lot of us don't have nuclear families anymore. Mom and dad living together. We have a lot of separated families. Mother or father don't live in the same household as the children. They visit. Um, but those connections can still be there. Uh, um, and for myself, I think that's really important, is that we be compassionate with each other, and we celebrate each other. So, with Father's Day coming up, um, I know for some people, the biological father is not there, uh, for whatever reason. Um, but hopefully, if not the biological father, maybe there are uncles, or maybe there are other um, role models, um, father figures that you can celebrate, for however that connection manifests for you. That's the hope, anyway. Um, but with Father's Day, just uh, take some time to contemplate that understanding of who fathers are, who men are, and our role, our traditional role, and nowadays, I guess you could say our evolved role, whether that's a good evolution or bad evolution. That can be up for debate. But just celebrating for a moment, um, with some perspective about where men are, and the place that we put men in our lives. Um, yeah, that end of it anyway. uh, so I guess just to leave it off, where one of the things I was taught growing up is different places that we look for inspiration, I guess. The main one that we were told is, that I remember growing up with, is understanding the sun. Uh, they call the sun our eldest brother. So uh, that male figure, because he's consistent, you know, every day, for as long as we've been alive, as long as our parents and generations back. The sun came up, traveled across the sky, did what it had to do, went down, rested, came up the next day. Might be from different positions depending on the season, but consistent. It happened every day. That's part of where we're at as men. It's part of what we're taught to embody and strive for, is that consistency. So that can be talking about keeping our word, following through. I know that's not always possible, particularly in this day and age, but doing your best to strive for that. And if there are men around you who aren't able to do that, take a look at where that came from. That doesn't mean that they're not responsible for it. They are responsible for it. But try to see it in your heart and your mind, to have some compassion for why that state of being is. Find some way to encourage them to come back to our sense of masculinity, our sense of being a man. Compassion. Have compassion for them. Yeah. So I hope that that gives you some perspective on fatherhood, masculinity, where it comes from, our understanding of it, and what we hope to strive for. Yeah. So I'll leave it at that. Any questions or anything like that? Hopefully I might be able to answer them for you, and let the people know who are going to be doing this recording for you, and presenting it for you. But yeah, we'll leave it at that for now. Donnie.